The morning sun was just peeking over the mountains when Tom Walker pulled into the small regional airport in Montana. The air had that crisp autumn bite to it, the kind that makes you zip your jacket up to your chin and wish you'd remembered your gloves. But Tom didn't mind. After 23 years of flying, these early morning starts felt as natural as breathing. He parked his old pickup truck in his usual spot, right next to the weather-beaten hangar where his trusty Cessna 172 waited. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and morning dew filled his nose as he grabbed his flight bag from the passenger seat. Something felt different today, though. Maybe it was the unusual stillness in the air, or perhaps it was those motorcycles parked near the airport cafe, definitely not the usual vehicles you'd see at a small airport like this. Tom took a sip from his coffee thermos, the warm liquid helping to chase away the morning chill. As he walked toward his plane, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He'd learned to trust these gut feelings over his years of flying. They'd saved his neck more than once during his time flying rescue missions in rough weather. Reaching his plane, Tom started his pre-flight checklist, the same routine he'd done thousands of times before. Check the fuel levels, inspect the propeller, test the flaps. Each step was like a familiar dance, one that good pilots never skipped, no matter how many hours they had under their belt. But today, the dance felt different. Those bikers he'd noticed earlier had moved closer, pretending to admire the planes, but their eyes kept drifting his way. They weren't your typical airplane enthusiasts. Tom knew the type well enough. These guys wore heavy leather jackets despite the cool morning being plenty warm enough for regular clothes. Their boots were scuffed, but their bikes gleamed like new money. Something about them set his teeth on edge. One of them, a tall guy with a thick beard, wandered over to Tom's plane. "Nice bird," he said, running his hand along the wing. His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes were cold as winter ice. "Thanks," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady while checking the landing gear. He'd dealt with all sorts during his flying career, from nervous first-time flyers to overconfident businessmen who thought they knew better than their pilot. These guys, they were something else entirely. The bearded man lingered, asking questions that seemed innocent enough but felt wrong somehow. How fast does she go? What's her range? How much fuel does she carry? Tom answered each one with practiced politeness, but kept his responses vague. 20 years of flying had taught him when to keep his cards close to his chest. More bikers drifted over, forming a loose circle around the plane. They tried to make it look casual, but Tom hadn't survived 2 decades of mountain flying by being unobservant. They were positioning themselves deliberately, like wolves circling a deer. His heart rate picked up a notch, but he kept his movements calm and methodical as he continued his inspections. Through the corner of his eye, he noticed one of them typing something on a phone. Another spoke quietly into what looked like a radio hidden in his jacket collar. Red flags were popping up faster than spring dandelions, but Tom knew better than to let on that he noticed. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response to danger was to act like you hadn't spotted it yet. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the tarmac. More planes were arriving for the day's flights, and the airport was starting to wake up. The bikers seemed to notice this too. They began to drift away, but not before the bearded one gave Tom a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Safe flights," he said, and something in his tone made those 2 simple words sound more like a threat than a wish. Tom watched them mount their bikes, the engines roaring to life with a synchronized rumble that seemed too practiced to be coincidental. As they rode toward the airport exit, he noticed something that made his blood run cold, a small emblem on their jackets, visible only when the sun caught it just right. A skull with wings, the same symbol he'd seen on the news a few months back in a story about aviation theft and smuggling. Pulling out his phone, Tom's fingers hovered over the keypad. Should he call airport security? The police? But what would he say? That some bikers had asked him questions about his plane? That they looked suspicious? He had nothing concrete to report, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. And in all his years of flying, those gut feelings had never steered him wrong. Instead of making the call, Tom did something that would later prove to be one of the smartest decisions of his life. He snapped a few discreet photos of the bikers as they rode away, making sure to capture their license plates. Then he went back to his pre-flight checks, but this time with extra attention to every detail, every latch, every gauge. The morning had started like any other, but Tom knew deep in his bones that this flight would be different. As he climbed into the cockpit, he could still feel eyes on him, though the bikers were long gone. He radioed the tower for clearance, his voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his veins. Whatever was coming, he'd be ready for it. He had to be. The control tower cleared Tom for takeoff, their voice crackling through his headset like any other morning. But this wasn't any other morning. As he guided his Cessna toward the runway, the weight of those strange encounters with the bikers sat heavy in his stomach like bad coffee. Through his side window, he spotted movement near the airport fence. More motorcycles were pulling up, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. These weren't the same guys from earlier. These bikes were different, sleeker, built for speed rather than show. Their riders wore the same leather jackets though, with those wing skull patches that made Tom's neck hair stand on end. He tried telling himself he was being paranoid. After all, bikers had every right to hang around an airport. But then he remembered something his old flight instructor used to say. There's no such thing as paranoia in aviation, only healthy caution and stupid mistakes. The engine hummed to life as Tom ran through his takeoff checklist. Everything looked normal, felt normal. The fuel gauge showed full tanks, just as he'd verified during his walk around. But he double-checked anyway. In his 2 decades of flying, he'd learned that the day you skip a check is the day you need it most. A quick glance at his watch showed 7:15 a.m. Perfect timing. He'd beat the morning rush of private planes heading to bigger cities. The radio crackled again as the tower gave him final clearance. As he pushed the throttle forward, he caught something in his mirror that made his heart skip. Those bikers were mounting up, their engines roaring to life in perfect sync, like they'd rehearsed it. The Cessna picked up speed, wheels rumbling against the runway. Tom felt the familiar push against his seat, the slight wiggle of the nose wheel that always came just before liftoff. This was usually his favorite moment of any flight. That magical instant when gravity lost its grip and Earth became sky. But today, something felt off. Just as his wheels left the ground, he spotted 3 more bikes tearing down the access road that ran parallel to the runway. They were matching his speed, keeping pace with his takeoff roll. That wasn't just unusual, it was impossible to explain away as coincidence. Tom's mind raced as he climbed into the cool morning air. Those weren't just random bikers, they had to be the Sky Ravens. He'd heard whispers about them at pilot gatherings, stories that seemed too wild to be true. They were supposed to be just rumors, a gang that used ground crews to track small planes, forcing them to land at remote airstrips. Some said they were after drug shipments, others claimed they were stealing planes themselves, but no one had ever proven anything. Banking gently to his planned heading, Tom keyed his radio. Tower, November 347 Lima. Any other aircraft departing behind me? The response made his mouth go dry. 3 small planes had just requested immediate takeoff clearance. The morning sun caught his wing as he leveled off at 3,000 feet. Below him, the bikes had split up, taking different roads but all heading in the same general direction, his direction. He'd planned this flight to follow the highway for the first 20 minutes anyway, but now that route felt like a trap waiting to spring. Tom reached for his phone, then stopped. Who would he call? What would he say? Hello, police? Some motorcycles are driving the same way and flying. It sounded ridiculous even in his head. But his gut was screaming that something bigger was unfolding. He pulled out his flight map, hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The planned route would take him over increasingly remote terrain. If those bikers were really Sky Ravens, and if those planes requesting takeoff were their birds, he'd be playing right into their hands. Making a show of checking his instruments, Tom casually glanced behind him. Sure enough, 3 small aircraft had just taken off and were climbing fast. Too fast. They weren't loaded down with cargo like he was supposed to be. His cargo today was just some machine parts for a rancher, but he had a feeling these guys thought he was carrying something very different. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't the tower. The voice was rough, unfamiliar. November 347 Lima, recommend you start planning for an early landing. Weather ahead looks problematic. Tom checked his weather radar. The sky was clear for 100 miles in every direction. Below him, the bikers were still matching his course, spreading out along different roads but maintaining perfect parallel tracks with his flight path. They were herding him, he realized, like cowboys steering a stray calf back to the herd. Well, he wasn't going to play along. Tom took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath you take when you know everything's about to change. His hands were rock steady on the controls as he looked one more time at those 3 planes slowly gaining on him. Years of mountain flying had taught him a thing or two about handling tricky situations. These boys might be good, but they'd never flown these mountains like he had. A small smile crept across his face as he reached for the radio. Whatever game they were playing, they were about to learn why local pilots called him the ghost of the Montana skies. The radio crackled again, static mixing with that same gruff voice. November 347 Lima, recommend you begin descent. We've got some friends waiting to help with your cargo. Tom's throat tightened as he watched the 3 planes behind him spread out in a classic pursuit formation. He'd seen this pattern before, back in his Air Force days, but never from the wrong end. Through his windshield, the Montana landscape stretched out like a giant patchwork quilt, green forests, brown fields, and gray rocky outcrops, all stitched together by winding roads. Those roads were still dotted with motorcycles, their riders keeping perfect pace with his flight path. These guys were good, he had to give them that. They'd obviously done this before. Tom checked his fuel gauges for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Everything looked normal, but that didn't mean much. He'd heard stories about the Sky Ravens, how they sometimes tampered with fuel systems during pre-flight distractions. That's why they'd crowded around his plane earlier, he realized. They'd been looking for an opportunity. The morning sun caught his wing as he banked slightly, pretending to follow their suggested course. Below, the bikers adjusted their routes immediately, like a well-oiled machine. Tom couldn't help but admire their coordination, even if it made his skin crawl. They'd clearly practiced this many times. His radio crackled once more. Last warning, 7 Lima. Next time won't be so friendly. The voice had dropped all pretense now, cold as mountain snow. Tom glanced at his instruments, mind racing. He had about 20 minutes of fuel in his main tanks, or at least, that's what his gauges said. If they'd messed with his system, those numbers meant nothing. The pursuing planes were closer now. Through his rear window, he could make out their paint jobs, sleek and dark, with those same skull-wing emblems painted on their tails. They were faster than his Cessna, built for speed rather than the kind of flying he usually did. But speed wasn't everything up here in the mountains. A memory flashed through Tom's mind, something his grandfather used to say when teaching him to fly. The mountains don't care how fast your plane is. They only care if you know their moods. Well, he knew these mountains better than most. He'd spent 20 years learning their moods, their winds, their secrets. The plane on his left edged closer, sunlight glinting off its windshield. They were trying to box him in, force him lower toward their waiting ground crew. Standard procedure for air pirates, get their target low and slow, then guide them to a makeshift landing strip. Not today, though, not with his plane. Tom reached for his backup radio, the one not connected to his main electrical system. He'd installed it years ago after a close call with a snowstorm killed his primary radio. As his fingers found the switch, he smiled slightly. The Sky Ravens might be good, but they didn't know about this. The countryside below was changing now, forest giving way to rockier terrain. They were approaching what locals called the maze, a series of twisted canyons and ridgelines that had claimed more than a few overconfident pilots over the years. Most pilots avoided it completely. Tom had flown it so many times he could probably do it blindfolded. One of the pursuing planes edged closer, close enough that Tom could see the pilot's face. He was wearing sunglasses, but Tom could read the confidence in his posture. These guys thought they had him cornered. They thought they knew these guys. They were wrong on both counts. Tom's hand stayed steady on the controls as he made his decision. The pursuing planes had positioned themselves perfectly, exactly where he wanted them. They thought they were hurting him, but he'd been subtly guiding their formation for the past 10 minutes, using their own tactics against them. Below, the bikers were starting to fall behind as the roads became more twisted. They'd lost their advantage in the rougher terrain, just as Tom had planned. Now it was just him and the 3 planes, dancing through the morning sky above Montana's roughest country. The pursuing pilots didn't notice the slight wind shift that made the treetops bend. They didn't see the telltale cloud formations building over the ridgeline. But Tom did. He'd learned to read these signs like others read street signs. Up here, that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. "Sorry, boys," Tom muttered, reaching for the throttle. "Time for your mountain flying lesson." His engine rode as he made his move, banking hard toward a narrow canyon that looked like a death trap to untrained eyes. But Tom knew better. He knew about the hidden updraft that lurked there, knew exactly how to ride it up and over the ridge while staying out of sight. The radio exploded with angry voices as the pursuing planes scrambled to follow. But they were already out of position, thrown off by his sudden move. Their faster planes meant nothing now. In these canyons, speed could kill you quicker than a bullet. As Tom's Cessna sliced through the morning air, those voices on the radio grew more desperate. They knew what he was doing now, but it was too late. He'd drawn them into his world, where knowing the mountains mattered more than having the fastest plane or the best coordinated ground crew. The chase was really about to begin, and for the first time that morning, Tom felt truly in his element. These sky pirates were about to learn why local pilots called this area the Maze, and why they called him the Ghost. Tom's mind worked as fast as his hands as he guided his Cessna through the morning air. 20 years of military flying had taught him that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Right now, he needed to think, and think fast. 3 planes were on his tail, each one faster and more agile than his old cargo hauler, but he had one advantage they didn't: experience. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain peaks ahead, creating a natural map that only seasoned mountain pilots could read. Tom had spent years learning these patterns, understanding how wind and shadow played together in these hills. Now, all that knowledge was about to pay off. His radio crackled with angry voices as the pursuing planes struggled to match his course. "You're only making this harder on yourself, 7 Lima." The voice sounded less confident now, a hint of frustration creeping in. Tom allowed himself a small smile as he checked his instruments. His fuel gauge still showed plenty, but he couldn't trust it, not after those bikers had been crowding around his plane. Below, the motorcycles had completely lost their advantage. The winding mountain roads had forced them to slow down, breaking their perfectly coordinated formation. Now it was just Tom and the 3 planes behind him, dancing through the thin mountain air at 5,000 feet. He spotted what he was looking for, a particular rock formation that locals called the Doorway. It looked like just another cliff face to untrained eyes, but Tom knew better. Behind that wall of rock lay a narrow valley that could either be his salvation or his doom. Everything depended on timing, skill, and a little bit of luck. The pursuing planes were closing in again, trying to force him lower. They were good, he had to admit that. Their formation was tight, professional, but they were flying by the book, and up here in the mountains, the book could get you killed. These peaks wrote their own rules, and Tom had spent years learning them. He reached for his backup radio, the one he'd installed after that close call in '98. The frequency was already set to the local emergency band. He wouldn't call for help, not yet. But having the option gave him some comfort as he prepared for what came next. The plane on his left edged closer, sunlight glinting off its polished surface. Tom could see the pilot now, wearing expensive sunglasses and a confident smirk. These guys were used to their prey giving up, following orders, landing where told. But they'd never chased someone like Tom before. His hands moved steadily over the controls as he did some quick math in his head. Altitude, wind speed, fuel reserves, everything had to be perfect for what he was planning. One mistake, and he'd be decorating the side of a mountain. But if he got it right, he'd teach these sky pirates a lesson they'd never forget. The air got rougher as they approached the higher peaks. Tom's Cessna bounced in the turbulence, but he kept her steady. Behind him, the pursuing planes were starting to struggle. Their faster aircraft weren't built for this kind of flying. They were made for straight lines and smooth air, not mountain dance. A memory flashed through Tom's mind, his old flight instructor's voice. "The mountains will show you what your plane is really made of." Well, he was about to show these guys what his plane could do. More importantly, he was about to show them what a real mountain pilot could do. The wind shifted suddenly, just as Tom had expected. He'd seen the signs. The way the clouds clung to the peaks, the subtle change in how the treetops moved. The pursuing pilots missed these clues, too focused on their target to read the mountain's warnings. Tom's altimeter spun as he began his move. The pursuing planes tried to follow, but they were already out of position. He'd been setting this up for the last 10 minutes, subtly guiding them into exactly the wrong spot for what was coming next. The radio erupted with urgent voices as the sky pirates realized something was wrong. But they were too late. Tom had already committed to his plan. His Cessna rolled into a tight turn, heading straight for what looked like a solid rock wall. At the last possible moment, he banked hard, slipping through a gap in the rocks that only locals knew about. The passage was tight, way too tight for the faster planes to follow safely. They'd have to go around, losing precious time and position. Tom's breathing remained steady as he threaded his way through the narrow canyon. Every move was calculated, every adjustment precise. This wasn't just flying anymore. This was an aerial chess game, and he was several moves ahead. The mountains closed in around him as he followed the hidden valley. Behind him, he could hear the frustration in the pirates' radio calls as they realized their mistake. They'd brought their fancy planes and coordinated ground crews to a mountain fight, but they'd forgotten the most important rule of flying these peaks: respect the mountains, or they'll teach you respect the hard way. As his Cessna emerged from the other side of the valley, Tom knew the real challenge was just beginning. He bought himself some time and thrown off their carefully planned attack, but the sky pirates wouldn't give up easily. Now he needed to turn their frustration into mistakes, and he knew exactly how to do it. The walls of the maze loomed ahead, their rocky faces catching the morning sun. Tom's hands were steady on the controls as he guided his Cessna toward the narrow entrance. Local pilots had another name for this place, the washing machine, because if you didn't know exactly what you were doing, it would toss you around until something broke. Behind him, two of the pursuing planes had fallen back, clearly unsure about following him into the canyon. The third one, though, the one with the skull emblem painted largest on its tail, stayed close. Tom could almost feel the other pilot's determination through the morning air. This guy was either very good or very foolish, maybe both. The radio had gone quiet now. They'd given up trying to talk him down, which meant things were about to get serious. Tom took a deep breath, tasting the thin mountain air that leaked through his cabin vents. His old flight instructor's words echoed in his head. The canyon doesn't care how brave you are. It only cares if you're smart. The first turn came up fast, a sharp left that looked impossible until you spotted the hidden channel behind the rock face. Tom knew this route like he knew his own home. He'd flown it in sunshine, rain, and even once in snow when a medical emergency had forced his hand. Each time, the canyon had taught him something new. His radio crackled suddenly. "Getting tired yet, old man?" The voice was younger, cockier than before. "That cargo must be weighing you down. Why don't you set her down nice and easy? There's a perfect strip just 2 miles east." Tom shook his head. They still thought this was about cargo. They hadn't figured out yet that he was flying empty, just machine parts in his hold, nothing worth all this trouble. The canyon walls squeezed tighter as he entered the section locals called the Throat. Shadows played across his wings as he threaded through the narrow pass. The pursuing pilot was good. Tom had to give him that. He was matching every move, staying just far enough back to avoid the worst turbulence from Tom's wake. A flash of movement caught Tom's eye. One of the other planes had found a higher route, trying to track him from above the canyon. Smart move, but it wouldn't help them. Up there, they'd be fighting different winds, unable to drop down quickly if they spotted an opportunity. Tom's mind worked through his options as he flew deeper into the maze. He had maybe 10 minutes of complicated flying ahead before the canyon opened up again. 10 minutes where every second could bring a new challenge. The air down here moved like water in a stream, flowing around obstacles in ways you had to feel rather than think about. The next turn was coming up, the one that had earned this place its nickname. 3 tight bends in quick succession, each one hiding the next until you were already committed. Tom had seen better pilots than these sky ravens turn back at this point, but he knew something they didn't. Just before the first bend, Tom spotted the signs he was looking for. A particular pattern in the morning shadows, a certain way the wind was moving the few hardy trees that clung to the canyon walls. Perfect conditions for what he had planned. The pursuing pilot was getting cocky now, edging closer. Through his mirror, Tom could see the other plane's nose bobbing up and down as it fought the turbulence. That was mistake number one. You don't fight the canyon's air, you dance with it. Tom eased his throttle back slightly, making it look like he was struggling with the upcoming turns. The pursuing plane crept closer, falling right into his trap. That was mistake number two. Never tailgate in a canyon, no matter how tempting the target. The first bend arrived, and Tom rolled his Cessna into it with practiced ease. The canyon walls blurred past his windows as he held the turn, timing it perfectly. Behind him, he heard the other pilots startled curse over the radio as the hidden winds hit his plane exactly where Tom knew they would. This was the canyon's secret, a vertical current that formed like clockwork on clear mornings. It could toss a plane around like autumn leaves if you weren't ready for it. But if you knew it was coming, if you knew exactly when to adjust your controls, you could use it to your advantage. Tom's plane rode the current up while the pursuing aircraft got caught in the downdraft. He heard the other pilot's engine roar as it fought for altitude, burning precious fuel. That was mistake number three. You don't power through mountain air, you let it show you the way through. The next two turns came in quick succession. Tom flowed through them like water, each movement smooth and precise. Behind him, the pursuer's curse-filled radio calls told him everything he needed to know. The Sky Raven's ace pilot was learning some hard lessons about mountain flying and learning them the expensive way. As they emerged from the three-turn sequence, Tom allowed himself a quick glance back. The pursuing plane had fallen behind, its pilot finally showing some respect for the canyon's challenges. Above, the other two planes were still tracking him, but they were too high to do anything useful. Tom checked his fuel gauges again, knowing he couldn't trust them but needing to maintain his habits. The canyon still had plenty of tricks to show these sky pirates, and he intended to demonstrate every single one. After all, they'd wanted a flying lesson. Well, class was definitely in session. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky as Tom emerged from the canyon's grip. His hands were steady, but tiny beads of sweat had formed on his forehead. The worst of the canyon flying was behind him, but he knew better than to relax. 20 years of flying had taught him that the moment you think you're safe is usually when things get interesting. His radio crackled to life, but this time it wasn't the Sky Pirates' threats that came through. The voice was different, crisp, professional, military. Cessna 347 Lima, this is Hawk 1. We've got your 6. Tom's heart leaped as two F-16s swept past his wings, their silver bodies gleaming in the sunlight. Through his side window, he watched as one of the fighter jets pulled alongside his Cessna, close enough that he could see the pilot give him a thumbs up. The Sky Raven's planes scattered like startled birds, breaking formation as they realized their game had suddenly changed. The hunter had become the hunted. Tom's emergency radio, the one he'd switched on back in the canyon, had done its job. While he was leading those pirates on a wild chase through the mountains, his distress signal had been bouncing between peaks, reaching further than he dared hope. The Air National Guard had picked it up, and they'd been tracking the whole situation. The radio came alive again, this time with the panicked voices of the Sky Ravens. Break off! Break off! Their coordinated formation had dissolved into chaos. One plane banked hard left, another pulled up sharply, while the third, the hotshot who'd followed Tom into the canyon, seemed frozen in indecision. Tom watched as the F-16s split up, each one picking a target to pursue. These weren't just any Guard pilots, this was the Mountain Home Squadron, specialists in high-altitude intercepts. The Sky Pirates might have been good at chasing cargo planes, but they were way out of their league now. His fuel gauge was showing a quarter tank, still not trustworthy, but he had to work with what he had. The nearest airport was 30 minutes away, but with the F-16s on scene, he finally felt safe enough to change course. As he banked towards safer skies, he could hear the Guard pilots coordinating their pursuit of the fleeing aircraft. Below, the motorcycle gang had regrouped on a mountain road, probably trying to figure out what had gone wrong with their perfect plan. They'd lost their air support, and now their carefully coordinated operation was falling apart. Tom allowed himself a small smile as he spotted police cars converging on their position. Someone in the Guard had been thorough enough to alert local law enforcement. The lead F-16 pilot's voice came through again. 7 Lima, we've got a full ID on these birds now. They've been on our watch list for months. You just helped us crack a case we've been building since last summer." Tom nodded to himself. Those skull emblems had looked familiar for a reason. He'd seen them in the news, always just glimpses in stories about missing cargo and mysterious aircraft. As he flew toward the nearest airfield, Tom could hear the guard pilots describing the scene to their base. 2 of the Sky Raven's planes had already been forced to land at small airstrips. The third, his canyon-chasing friend, was still trying to escape, but he was burning fuel fast. He wouldn't get far. Through his windshield, Tom watched the mountain landscape roll by below. The same peaks that had been his allies in the chase now looked peaceful, serene. A passenger jet cruised high above, its passengers probably unaware of the drama that had just played out in the skies below them. His radio picked up fragments of conversation between the guard pilots and their base. Words like federal investigation and ongoing surveillance drifted through the static. This had been bigger than just a random cargo heist. The Sky Ravens had picked the wrong pilot on the wrong day, and their whole operation was about to unravel. One of the F-16s pulled alongside again, keeping station with his slower Cessna. The pilot radioed over, "Hope you don't mind the escort, 7 Lima. Base wants to make sure you get home safe." Tom keyed his mic to thank them, but his voice caught for a moment. After the intensity of the last hour, the simple kindness in that offer hit him harder than he'd expected. As they flew toward the airport, Tom thought about all the little decisions that had led to this moment. The backup radio he'd installed years ago. The hours spent learning every quirk of the mountain winds. The instinct that had made him suspicious of those bikers at first sight. All of it had come together today, turning what could have been a tragedy into something very different. The morning sun was high now, burning away the last shadows in the valleys below. In the distance, Tom could see his destination airport, its runway a welcoming stripe of gray among the green. He knew there would be questions waiting on the ground, lots of them. FBI agents would want statements, the guard would need reports, and local news stations would probably come sniffing around for a story. But right now, with an F-16 on each wing and the mountains standing guard behind him, Tom felt nothing but gratitude. He'd matched wits with the Sky Pirates and outflanked them in their own game. More importantly, he'd helped bring down a gang that had been terrorizing small aircraft owners across the region. The landing gear touched down with a gentle squeak as Tom brought his Cessna to rest on the runway. 2 police cars and several unmarked vehicles were already waiting near the taxiway. As he powered down his engine, he could see men in suits walking toward his plane. FBI agents, no doubt. The morning's adventure was over, but he had a feeling the real work was just beginning. An agent named Bill Thompson met him at the door of his plane. "That was some fancy flying up there," he said, offering Tom a bottle of water. "We've been after the Sky Ravens for 18 months. Never could get enough evidence to move on them until today." Tom took a grateful sip, suddenly realizing how dry his throat had become during the chase. Inside the airport's small conference room, the story began to unfold. The Sky Ravens weren't just cargo thieves, they were part of a larger operation that had been plaguing small airports across 3 states. They'd developed a system. Identify planes they thought were carrying valuable cargo, force them to land at remote strips, then make the cargo and sometimes the entire plane disappear. "Your distress signal changed everything," another agent explained, spreading photos across the table. "We knew they were operating in this area, but we could never catch them in the act. Then you led them right into our hands." The photos showed familiar faces, the bikers from the airport, their planes, hidden airstrips tucked away in remote valleys. Tom's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other local pilots. Word had spread fast about the morning's events. In a tight-knit flying community like this, news like that traveled at the speed of radio waves. Every pilot who'd ever felt uneasy about strange aircraft following them or suspicious characters hanging around small airports was breathing a little easier today. The Air National Guard pilots who'd come to his rescue stopped by to shake his hand. They were younger than Tom had expected, but their eyes had the sharp look of people who knew their business in the air. "That canyon flying was something else," one of them said. "We've got video from our gun cameras." The brass back at base couldn't believe what they were seeing. As the day wore on, more details emerged. The Sky Ravens had been getting bolder, targeting larger shipments and more valuable aircraft. They'd picked Tom's plane because they'd received bad intelligence. Someone had told them he was carrying a shipment of specialized electronic components. Instead, all they'd found was a crate of replacement parts for a rancher's tractor. Their whole operation fell apart today, Thompson explained, showing Tom a map marked with red dots, all the places where police had rounded up Sky Ravens members. Those bikers on the ground were their spotters and ground crew. When your distress signal went out, it triggered responses from law enforcement across 3 counties. We caught most of them still on their bikes, trying to figure out why their perfect plan had gone wrong. The 3 planes that had chased Tom were now sitting on various small airstrips, surrounded by federal agents. Their pilots were sitting like birds, each trying to make a deal before the others could. The Sky Ravens' carefully built criminal empire was crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. Late in the afternoon, Tom finally got a chance to really look at his plane. The mechanics had gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, checking for any tampering. They found it. A clever device attached to his fuel gauge designed to make it read full even when the tank was running dry. The Sky Ravens had planned to force him down by letting him run out of fuel. Instead, they'd learned a hard lesson about underestimating a local pilot who knew his mountains. The sun was setting when Tom finally headed home, but not before the airport manager stopped him. "The flying community owes you one," he said, shaking Tom's hand. "Those pirates have been scaring pilots away from small airports for months. You just gave us all our skies back." Over the next few weeks, the story came out in bits and pieces. The Sky Ravens had started small, targeting occasional cargo shipments, mostly at night. But success had made them greedy and careless. They'd started working in daylight, taking bigger risks, making more enemies. All they needed was one person to stand up to them, one pilot who could turn their own game against them. The federal investigation revealed more than anyone had expected. The gang had stolen millions in cargo, several aircraft, and had been planning to expand their operation to other states. Instead, they were facing federal charges that would keep them grounded for a very long time. Tom went back to his regular flying routine, but things were different now. Other pilots would wave when they saw his Cessna, and he'd gotten more than a few free cups of coffee at airport diners. He didn't much care for the attention, but he had to admit it felt good knowing he'd helped make the skies a little safer for everyone. One morning, about a month after the chase, Tom was doing his pre-flight checks when a young student pilot came up to him. "Is it true what they say?" The kid asked. "About you out flying 3 planes in the canyon?" Tom just smiled and patted his plane's worn metal skin. "The mountains are the best teachers," he said. "They'll show you what flying's really about if you're willing to learn." That's how the story of the Sky Ravens ended, not with a dramatic shootout or a high-speed chase, but with a pilot who knew his craft, trusted his instincts, and wasn't afraid to use the mountains themselves as allies. The skies above Montana were a little quieter now, but every pilot who flew through them knew the story of the day when one man in an old Cessna had shown a gang of sky pirates that they'd picked the wrong pilot to chase.